A man was found near railroad tracks with his head cut off and 6 tattoos on his body. One said Helen. One said Paul. One bore the initials WCG. The police made a plaster cast of his reconstructed head, photographed every tattoo, and displayed them at the Great Lakes Exposition, one of the largest public exhibitions in the country. Hundreds of thousands of visitors walking past this dead man's face. Somebody somewhere knew who he was. Somebody knew Helen. Somebody knew Paul. Nobody came forward. 90 years later, nobody has. He is still called the Tattooed Man because that is all anyone can call him. And he is not even the hard case. He is one of at least 12 people killed and dismembered in the same city in the same years. And he is one of the lucky ones because at least he had tattoos. At least he carried something on his skin that might bring someone forward to say his name. Most of the others had nothing. No tattoos, no fingerprints on file, no one who filed a report when they stopped showing up. Of 12 victims, only 2 were ever positively identified. The rest are known by numbers. Victim number 4, victim number 6, victim number 9. They were murdered and they were not even given back their names. To understand how that is possible, how 10 people can be killed in a major American city and no one can say who they were, you have to understand where they lived. There was a ravine cutting through Cleveland's east side called Kingsbury. Run a gash of creek bed and railroad track through the industrial flats too low and too ugly for anyone with a choice. During the Depression, men who had lost jobs, then homes, then families built shelters there from scrap wood and flattened tin cans. They had no addresses. Most had no work. Many had no one who would think to look for them if they stopped showing up. And someone understood that about them perfectly. Every one of the 12 was decapitated. Most were dismembered. The cuts, according to the coroner, showed skill, a steady hand, an understanding of where the joints come. Apart, no hesitation marks. Whoever did this had medical training, or something close to it. The disarticulations followed anatomical knowledge, not slaughterhouse practice. The discoveries came in waves. 2 boys playing on Jackass Hill, stumbling on 2 headless bodies at the base of the slope. A woman finding human remains wrapped in newspaper and packed into baskets near a vacant lot. A teenage girl walking through the woods and finding a decomposing torso. The bodies were left in places where they would be found, but not quickly, and not by anyone with authority. They were found by children, by scavengers, by people walking through the margins of the city. The killer did not need to hide his work. He only needed to put it where the city was not looking, and the city was not looking at Kingsbury Run. The 2 victims who were identified tell you something by contrast. Edward Andrassy, 28. A former hospital orderly, the police found him because his fingerprints were in the system from minor run-ins with the law. Florence Polillo, around 40, a waitress and barmaid, identified the same way through prints on file. They were known to the system only because they had been in trouble with it. The ones who had never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, never been booked. They vanished twice. Once when the killer took their lives, and once when the city could not even give them back their names. The investigation was led, and this is the part that has drawn the most attention for 90 years, and I think for the wrong reasons, by Eliot Ness. Yes, that Eliot Ness. The man who had helped bring down Al Capone in Chicago was, by the mid-1930s, the safety director of Cleveland, the city's top law enforcement official in charge of police and fire. He was young, brilliant, incorruptible, and completely out of his depth. I should be honest about what that means because Ness has been both romanticized and blamed for this case, and neither is quite right. He was an organizer, a corruption fighter, a man built to dismantle systems of power. The Torso Killer was not a system. He was a shadow moving through a population that the system had already decided not to watch. Ness's tools, raids, wiretaps, informant networks. The blunt instruments of organized crime investigation were useless against a killer whose victims could not even be named. You cannot trace a murder backward through a life that left no paperwork. And here is where the investigation crossed a line that I think Johnson needs to sit with, honestly, because it is the ugliest moment in the whole case. And it is not the killer's doing it, is Ness's. On August 18th, 1938, 2 days after the last bodies were found, placed with what looks like deliberate provocation, within sight of Ness's own office, Ness ordered a raid on the Kingsbury Run shantytown. 35 officers, 11 squad cars, 2 vans, 3 fire trucks. They moved through the shacks in the dark, gathered up over 60 people, and at dawn on Ness's orders, the shanties were set on fire and burned to the ground. 300 people were evicted. 100 structures were destroyed. His stated logic was simple. Kingsbury Run was the killer's hunting ground, and if you remove the prey, you remove the predator. The press destroyed him for it, and they were right too. Because here is what Ness actually did that night, stripped of the tactical language. He took the community where the victims had lived, the only place where someone might have recognized a face, noticed an absence remembered, a detail, and he erased it. He did not protect potential victims. He scattered them to places where no one would know them, where they would be even more alone, even more invisible than they had been in the run. He solved the problem of people dying in Kingsbury Run by making sure there were no people left in Kingsbury Run. The killing stopped. The case was never solved. There is a suspect. I owe you that because the police believed they knew even if they could never prove it. His name was Francis Sweeney, a physician, a man with surgical training that would explain the precision of the cuts, and the first cousin of a sitting United States congressman. Ness reportedly had Sweeney brought in for private interrogation and subjected to polygraph testing by the inventor of the device. Sweeney, by most accounts, failed the test. Shortly after, he committed himself to a mental institution. The murders stopped. And there is another name, darker and more troubling. Frank Dolezal, a bricklayer, who had known at least 2 of the identified victims. He was arrested by the county sheriff in 1939, not by Ness's team, but by a political rival, and he confessed. Then he died in custody officially by suicide, hanging from a hook in his cell. The coroner found he had 6 broken ribs. The confession, extracted under circumstances that have never been fully explained, was the only one the case ever produced, and the man who gave it was dead before he could recant or confirm it. I tell you this not because Dolezal was the killer. The evidence was thin even by the standards of the day, but because it shows you what happens when a case like this festers long enough. It stops being an investigation and becomes a political weapon. And the people who get caught in it are once again the ones without power. And here I have to be as careful with Sweeney as I am with every other name in this kind of work. The polygraph is not reliable evidence. It was not admissible then and is not admissible now. The political connection to a congressman may have shielded Sweeney, or it may have made Ness overly determined to build a case that circumstance alone could not support. Sweeney was never charged. He was never tried. And the convenient narrative doctor with the right skills, political protection. The murders stop when he disappears into an institution is exactly the kind of story that feels like an answer without quite being one. I give it to you as the strongest theory the investigation produced. I will not dress it up as the truth, because the truth of this case is not who killed 12 people in Kingsbury Run. The truth is that 10 of them are still waiting to be named. 90 years later, the DNA Doe Project and the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner are finally trying exhuming remains, extracting DNA, searching for descendants who might recognize a great-uncle or grandfather who left home during the Depression and never came back. The technology exists now. What did not exist then and barely exists now is a system that notices when invisible people disappear. The killer chose his victims the way a predator chooses prey, not the strongest, not the most defended, but the ones no one would miss. And the cruelest thing about this case is not what he did to them. It is that he was right. It would be easy to file that away as a Depression-era horror, a product of its time, a problem of extreme poverty, and a primitive identification system. Fingerprints on file could solve it now. Modern databases would track the missing. The system has improved. So let me take you somewhere with modern databases and a national police force and a country that considers itself among the most progressive on earth, and show you that the same thing happened. Not because the technology was missing, but because the people who disappeared belonged to communities that the system had decided long before any of them went missing were not worth the full weight of its attention. For that, we drive north into the interior of British Columbia, along a highway that earned its name the hardest way possible. Ramona Wilson was 15 years old and walked into a friend's house in Smithers, British Columbia on a June evening in 1994. The distance was short. The route was familiar. She did not arrive. Her body was found 10 months later near the airport outside of town. No one was ever charged. She was not the first girl to vanish along this stretch of road. She was not the last. Along a 700-kilometer corridor of highway cutting through the forests of northern British Columbia, a 2-lane strip of asphalt between Prince George and Prince Rupert that the families would come to call the Highway of Tears. Women and girls had been disappearing since the late 1960s. Delphine, Nicole, 16 last seen hitchhiking near Burns Lake in 1990, never found. Lana Derrick, 19 last seen near Terrace in 1995, never found. Alberta Williams, 24, found near Prince Rupert. In 1989, cause of death, never conclusively established. I list their names because someone should, and because the system that was supposed to record their lives recorded mostly their absence. The RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Canada's federal law enforcement officially links 18 cases to this corridor murders and disappearances of women between 1969 and 2006. Indigenous communities along the highway say the number is closer to 40 or 50, and that the RCMP's count reflects only the cases that pass through a set of bureaucratic filters narrow enough to exclude many of the people who vanished. I am not going to try to settle that number because settling it is not the point, and the disagreement itself is the point. When the families say 50 and the police say 18, the gap between those numbers is not a statistical dispute. It is a measure of how many disappearances the system chose not to count. The victims are overwhelmingly indigenous women and girls, and many of them were hitchhiking, not because they were careless, but because the Canadian government never built a reliable transit link between the First Nations communities along Highway 16. The road was the only connection between reserves and towns, between home and school, between a girl and wherever she needed to be. And the road was 700 kilometers of dense forest and empty shoulders, with nobody watching. I need to pause here and say something about how these cases were handled when they were first reported, because the handling is the mechanism, and if I skip it, I'm skipping the whole point. When families reported a daughter or a sister missing, the default response from the RCMP in many documented cases was some version of she probably left on her own, went to the city, ran off with someone, chose to disappear. That assumption that an indigenous girl who stops coming home has simply decided to be somewhere else is an assumption that carries a very specific weight. And I want to be direct about what that weight is. It is the assumption that her life was already disorganized enough that vanishing from it is normal. It is the assumption that this is what people like her do. And that assumption applied at the moment a missing person report is filed is the difference between a search that starts in hours and a search that starts in weeks, if it starts at all. To understand how lethal that delay is, you have to understand the highway itself. 700 kilometers of two-lane road through some of the most remote terrain in North America. Spruce forest so dense you lose the light 20 feet from the shoulder. Stretches of 60, 80, 100 kilometers between gas stations. In winter, temperatures drop below minus 30. A woman standing at the shoulder of this road at dusk, waiting for a ride that might or might not come in a place where there is no cell service, no street light, no house within sight, is as vulnerable as a human being can be. And when she accepts a ride from the wrong person, the forest on either side offers 1,000 places where a body can be left and never found. Several of the victims on the RCMP's list have never been recovered. The highway keeps them. I should be fair to the RCMP here because being fair is the job even when the institution makes it difficult. The RCMP has in recent years acknowledged failures in how these cases were handled. Project Ipana, launched in 2005 and expanded in 2007 to cover 18 cases across a wider area, was a genuine effort to revisit the files with modern tools and fresh eyes. At its peak, over 60 investigators worked the cases. They converted 700 boxes of old police files into a searchable database. They re-interviewed witnesses and families. They followed new leads. And they identified a suspect, Bobby Jack Fowler, an American convicted sex offender who had worked in the region as likely responsible for at least some of the murders. Fowler died in an Oregon prison in 2006 before charges could be brought. Another serial killer, Cody Legabakov, was convicted of 4 murders in the wider area. These are real results, and they matter, and I will not diminish them. But I also have to tell you what the lead investigator himself said publicly, because it is the most honest sentence anyone in this case has spoken. Perhaps they'll never be solved. That's the reality, and that's what I tell the families. A handful of answers in a field of open cases with the investigative team shrinking year by year, and the admission from the officer in charge that the truth may be beyond reach. Not because the killer was brilliant, because the window for finding it was open for decades, and nobody with authority climbed through it in time. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which ran from 2016 to 2019, heard testimony from families across the country. Its final report used a word that landed like a stone: genocide. Not every observer agreed with that word, and I will not tell you whether to accept it or not. That is a judgment that belongs to you. But the pattern the report described, a systemic decades-long failure to investigate the deaths and disappearances of Indigenous women with the same urgency, the same resources, and the same basic presumption of foul play that would have been applied if the victims had been white. That pattern is documented, and it is not in dispute by anyone who has examined the record seriously. Here is the detail I want to leave you with, because it is the quietest and the heaviest thing in this case. In 2006, after decades of advocacy, a limited bus service was finally established along parts of Highway 16. The families and communities had been asking for it for years, not as a crime-fighting measure, but as basic transportation. A way to get a teenager from her reserve to town without standing on the shoulder of a highway in the dark. The fact that it took the deaths and disappearances of dozens of women to produce a bus route tells you everything about the order of priorities. The infrastructure that might have saved lives was not built until after the lives were lost. And even then, the service remains limited. The highway is still long, and the distances between communities are still vast, and girls still need to get from here to there. The killer on the Highway of Tears. If there is one killer, which there almost certainly is not, did not need to be clever. He did not need to plan elaborately or conceal his work with particular care. He needed only to drive a road where the people standing at the shoulder had already been made vulnerable by every system that should have protected them, a government that would not build transit, a police force that would not search promptly, a national culture that had spent a century teaching itself that Indigenous lives were less urgent, less visible, less worth the resources. The invisibility was not a failure of policing in isolation. It was a condition woven into the geography, the infrastructure, the funding priorities, the assumptions on the intake forms, and it was in place long before the first woman ever put her thumb out on Highway 16. Johnson here, quick pause. These are heavy, and I know it. If you're still here, it's because you're the kind of person who thinks the hard ones are worth sitting with, and I'm grateful for that. Subscribe and bell if you want more of these. Now let me take you to the last case because it asks the hardest question of the three. In Cleveland, the victims were invisible because they had no names, no records, no one to file a report. On the Highway of Tears, the victims had names and families, but they belonged to communities the system had already decided were not worth its full attention. Both times you could argue the invisibility was a failure, something the system should have caught but didn't. The last case takes that away from you. It asks what happens when the invisibility is not a failure at all, when it is a feature. When an entire economy is designed from the ground up to produce workers who are replaceable, temporary, and silent, and when those workers start dying, and the system that made them invisible has no mechanism and no incentive to make them visible again. A shift ends at a factory on the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez. It is late past dark. A young woman walks out through the gate with a handful of co-workers. They separate at the road. She walks toward the Colonia, where she rents a room, unpaved streets, no streetlights, cinder block houses on the edge of the desert. The walk is 15, maybe 20 minutes. She has done it hundreds of times. She does not arrive. And here is the thing that should stop you. The factory will notice she is absent from her next shift. It will record her absence. And in many documented cases, it will not report her missing, because turnover in the maquiladoras is high, and a worker who does not show up is simply replaced by the next one in line. Her absence is an administrative event, not an alarm. The system that employed her has no procedure for the possibility that her absence means she is dead. Since the early 1990s, hundreds of women have been murdered in Ciudad Juarez. The exact number depends on who is counting, and how some estimates exceed 300 since 1993. Others run higher when disappearances are included. The victims are overwhelmingly young, 15 to 25, and overwhelmingly poor. Many are maquiladora workers. Many are migrants from southern Mexico who came north for factory work, who live alone or in shared rooms, far from their families, in a city they did not grow up in. They have jobs, paychecks, shifts. They are not destitute. They are not homeless. They are, by any ordinary measure, visible, employed, documented present. And yet when they die, they disappear as completely as the nameless men of Kingsbury Run. I need to explain why, because the mechanism here is different from Cleveland and different from British Columbia. And understanding it is the whole reason I'm telling you this last. Ciudad Juarez sits on the U.S.-Mexico border directly across from El Paso, Texas. The maquiladora industry, foreign-owned assembly plants that import parts duty-free and export finished goods, was established there in the 1960s and exploded after the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994. The factories hired young women preferentially. They were considered more dexterous, more compliant, less likely to unionize. Thousands came north from the interior of Mexico for the work. They arrived alone. They knew no one. They rented rooms in colonias that had been thrown up practically overnight to house the workforce with no planning, no municipal services, no streetlights, no paved roads, no police patrols. They worked shifts that ended after dark and walked home through empty lots and unpaved alleys sometimes for 20 or 30 minutes past construction sites and abandoned buildings and patches of desert where the city simply stopped and the scrubland began. And they did this every night because the shift schedule was the shift schedule, and if you missed it, someone else would take your place by morning. The vulnerability was not incidental. It was structural. A young woman far from family in an unfamiliar city, working late, walking home alone through an unlit neighborhood. Every element of her danger was a direct product of the system that employed her. The factories did not provide buses. The city did not provide lights. The police did not patrol the colonias with the same attention they gave the commercial districts. And when one of these women disappeared between the factory gate and her front door, the gap she left was filled before anyone had time to ask where she had gone. And I have to be straight about the economics of this because it is uncomfortable. And it is the center. The maquiladora system was designed to produce cheap, flexible, replaceable labor. That was not a side effect. That was the product. A worker who stays for years, who builds seniority, who demands raises, is expensive. A worker who arrives, works for a season, and is replaced by the next migrant from Oaxaca or Veracruz is cheap. The entire system was optimized for turnover for workers who come and go without leaving a trace. And when some of those workers stopped coming to work because they were dead in the desert, the system that was built to not notice their departure did exactly what it was built to do. It did not notice. The Mexican authorities made arrests. I owe you that, and I owe you the context around them. An Egyptian chemist named Abdel Latif Sharif was convicted of one murder in 1999. Members of a gang called Los Rebeldes were arrested and accused of committing murders on Sharif's behalf. Bus drivers Los Ruteros were arrested in later years. In each wave of arrests, the government announced that the killers had been caught and the crisis was over. In each case, the killings continued. And here I have to tell you what international observers found, because it is the part the Mexican government did not volunteer. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights all documented evidence that some of these arrests involved confessions obtained under torture and suspects who appeared to be scapegoats, men who fit a convenient profile, whose convictions allowed the government to declare the problem solved while the problem continued. I will not tell you that every convicted man is innocent. I will tell you that the organizations with the deepest access and the least political motive to lie found the investigations deeply compromised, and that the pattern of arrest, announce, continue is not a pattern that belongs to a system that is working. The case that broke the silence, or tried to, was the cotton field. In November 2001, 8 women were found in a cotton field on the outskirts of Ciudad Juarez. 3 of them, Claudia Yvette Gonzalez, Esmeralda Herrera Monreal, and Laura Bernice Ramos Monares, became the center of a complaint filed with the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. I want to tell you who they were because the court case gave them legal standing, and I want to give them human standing. Claudia was 20, a maquiladora worker who had been reported missing. Esmeralda was 15, a child. Laura was 17, a student. They had mothers who loved them and who fought for them for years through an international legal system that was never designed to move quickly because the domestic system had failed them entirely. In 2009, the court ruled against Mexico in a decision that changed international human rights law. The state had failed to protect the women. It had failed to investigate their murders. It had tolerated and, in some documented instances, actively obstructed the pursuit of justice. The court ordered Mexico to investigate not only these murders, but the pattern behind them, to build a monument to the victims, to hold a public ceremony of acknowledgement, and to reform its investigative procedures. Some of these orders have been carried out. Many have not. The killings have continued. And here is the detail that has stayed with me longer than any other in this case, and it is the reason I saved Ciudad Juarez for last, the cotton field where those 8 women were found. The killing ground, the place where their bodies were left in the dirt, was located directly across the street from the headquarters of the Maquiladora Association. The industry's administrative center and the dumping ground for its dead workers were separated by a road. That is not a metaphor I am constructing for you. That is geography. And it tells you everything about how close the system was to the violence it produced, and how completely it had trained itself not to look across the street. The killings have not stopped. The maquiladoras are still running. Young women still walk home in the dark through unlit colonias on the edge of the desert. And the system, the economic engine that needs cheap, replaceable, silent labor and has no mechanism for noticing when that labor is killed, is still operating exactly as designed. The mothers have not stopped either. They march every year. They carry photographs. They paint pink crosses on telephone poles. At the sites where bodies were found, hundreds of crosses scattered across the city like a second map laid over the official one, marking the places the official map refuses to show. Some of them have received death threats for their advocacy. Some have been attacked. They continue anyway, because they understood before anyone else what this case is actually about. It is not about one killer or 10 killers or a cartel or a conspiracy. It is about a city that was built to use their daughters and to forget them, and mothers who refuse to allow the forgetting. The women of Juarez were not invisible the way the men of Kingsbury Run were invisible. They had names. They had paychecks. They clocked in and clocked out. Their invisibility was not a condition of poverty or homelessness. It was a condition of design, the design of an economy that needed them present enough to work a shift and absent enough to be replaced without questions when they did not show up for the next one. They were visible precisely as long as they were useful. The moment they stopped being useful because they were missing, because they were dead, the system let them go the way it was always going to, quietly, efficiently, without looking back. A ravine in Cleveland where men without names were cut apart during the Depression. A highway in British Columbia where indigenous women vanished for half a century while the police wrote probably left on her own. A border city in Mexico where factory workers walked into the dark and the factories simply hired the next one in line. Different decades, different countries, different killers if there even were single killers, which in 2 of these cases there almost certainly were not. But set them side by side and the same mechanism runs through all 3, quiet as a wire under the surface. In each case, the victims were not hidden by the killer. They were hidden before the killer. Hidden by poverty, by geography, by race, by an economy that needed them invisible. The murder was not the hard part. The hard part, the part that should have been easy, the part any functioning system should have caught, was getting someone to notice they were gone. We want to believe that every life is counted, that when a person disappears, a light goes on somewhere in the system, a missing persons report, a search, a detective assigned, a family believed. These 3 cases say something harder and more honest. Some lives are only counted when someone decides to count them. And the distance between being counted and not being counted is not about evidence or technology or funding. It is about who the system was built to see and who it was built to look past. The men of Kingsbury Run are finally being tested for DNA 90 years later. The families along the highway of tears are still waiting for answers. The RCMP has admitted may never come. The mothers of Juarez are still marching, still demanding, still holding photographs of daughters. The factories have long since replaced. They are doing the work the system would not do, making the invisible visible, one name at a time, one face at a time, for as long as it takes. The least the rest of us can do is learn their names. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next.